Ah, okay. Well, I guess you're gonna get a whole bunch of the roof of my car. Anyway, hello, good morning. It is Saturday morning, and I've been banished from my apartment because my sister is doing whatever she's doing. So I thought, okay, I'll see where if I can go hang out for a few hours. Because if I do end up getting evicted, I am going to be living in my car, and this is what I'll be doing a whole lot of. You'll be seeing a whole lot more of me from my car. Yay! Maybe not. I don't know. Anyway, it is Halloween, and on to happier topics than my eviction hearing. Today, I want to review Psycho, which is not on the 100 Click If You Dare 100 NPR favorite horror stories. But it is such an, I mean, such an iconic, I guess is the word, such a solid piece of horror history that I was actually, I was sitting there thinking, that's one I haven't read before. And I haven't even, picked it up in DNF. I just haven't gotten around to it. So I thought this was a perfect opportunity. So, and also another plug for, excuse me, sorry. I really should try and edit that out, but I'm too lazy. Um, just another quick plug, Chirp Audiobooks. I am not affiliated in any way. I'm not sponsored. I'm just really happy with them. I bought the audiobook of Psycho for, I think it was like $4 or $5, and it's fantastic. The audiobook of Psycho is just great. The reader is really compelling. He does all the different voices, so you get the feeling of a performance. And the way that the book is written and the way that the scenes are set up, it really does feel like a play. And like the way that the characters talk to each other, the dialogue feels like real people talking to each other, but at the same time it does move the action forward. It does give information about the plot and the characters and so on. So I thought that was one thing that I enjoyed, the first thing that I enjoyed about the audiobook. Now, having seen the movie many times, which I'm sure you have as well, sorry, there's people going by back behind me. I'm at the library. So having seen the movie many times, it's really hard to kind of extricate the actors in their roles because they were, again, so iconic. It's really hard to not envision those actors. Which, I mean, it says so much about the film, right? So, one thing that was very different about the Norman Bates character, we start, Norman Bates is arguing with his mother. This is the first chapter of the book. And they're talking about the hotel and how, motel, I guess it is, and how, their business has been really slow since the freeway went in. People just kind of go by, so they don't really stop in anymore. And right in the middle of the argument, the bell rings. They've got a customer. And the first big change from the book to the movie is that Norman is described as middle-aged. I think he's balding, wears glasses, he's overweight. I mean, he's your basement dwelling incel neckbeard way, 50 years before that was a thing, right? The 50, 60 years. So it's a very big difference from the trim, handsome, mostly handsome, I guess, depending on your type, Anthony Perkins. But Anthony Perkins still really, really creeped people out, which I think is why he probably got the part over a balding, middle-aged, heavy-set man. I don't know. Probably just because we like movie actors to be better looking than we are. so so the plot goes, Norman's arguing with his mother. He hears a bell ring. It's Mary, and that's another difference. In the book, she's Mary. In the film, she's Marion. I don't know why they changed it. That happens sometimes. Maybe Marion sounds more, mellifluous or something. Maybe. I know that I think when you use names in a film, sometimes if it's a name that there's only a few of them in the States, sometimes you do have to get a clearance to use the name. Maybe they couldn't get a clearance on that name. I don't know. Like if it's a name where there's hundreds of them in the phone book, like John Smith, nobody cares. But if it's a name that there aren't too many of them in the States, then sometimes they have to actually track down those people and say, we're going to use your name in a movie, right? And sometimes they have to change it if they can't get a clearance on that name. So at least I read that somewhere. I don't know if it's still the same. In the 50s, I'm pretty sure that it was kind of like that. I don't know 100%. Okay, you know what? Now I'm kind of second guessing. But I did read that somewhere, that if you've got somebody, because it was, I'm trying to remember the name, and there were like 3 of them in the United States, and they had to change the character's name because one of the 3 would not sign off on it. So anyway, Mary, excuse me, who is the book character, so we spend some time with her, and as in the movie, Mary, she's at her office. It's the end of the day, and her boss is a dick, and he creeps on her, treats her like a peon, and asks her to do a bank run and deposit this big case of cash while he jets off to his fucking yacht or something. I don't know. This guy's such a dick. And she looks at him, and she looks at the money, and he leaves, and she leaves, and she's thinking it over, and she's like, I bet nobody would notice. And so she, on a whim, just decides to steal the money and skip town. And I was, looking back on the film and listening to the audiobook and thinking about the crime, I thought that was really organic and interesting, the way that was set up, because a lot of the time, in movies, criminals are these, masterminds, and they set everything up, and it's intrigue, and they run from the cops, and the cops don't have a clue. But most of the time, crimes really are about opportunity and just sort of falling into things. And then you're kind of going by the seat of your pants trying to figure out, oh crap, what do I do now? And that just felt so much more natural, the way that she just ended up with this money. And then she has to figure out what she's going to do with it. Because she could go to the bank whenever the bank opens. I think in the 50s, banks weren't usually open on the weekends, but she decides to run instead because she's got this fiance who is heavily in debt and, sleeping in the back of his hardware store, which is the only thing he has in the world. Although, realistically, he could sell the hardware store and not be in debt anymore, but, he wants to have this business once he gets the debts paid off. And she's the kind of person who, whatever plans she ever made for herself, whatever things she ever wanted to do, she's just never gotten to do them. I think she's supposed to be in her late 20s. And, first she had to not go to school because she had to take care of her dying mother. And then she had to take care of her sister, who did get to go to school, which is pretty common, which is a pretty common trope in stories like this. And it also draws an interesting parallel, the relationships that Mary has with her mother and Norman has with his mother, this idea of the adult children that kind of have to stay, whereas Mary, her expectations are relatively normal, just in the way that women are expected to stick around. And then Norman's relationship with his mother is something that's kind of that's quite he's considered a mama's boy, and it's kind of twisted, when the sons don't go off and do things. So that does kind of put in sort of a gender expectation on those things, and more so in the 50s than now. I mean, now you have lots of, well, no, everybody that I've ever known that was over 30 and still living with his mother did kind of get the side eye. Although the last probably decade or so, a lot of people, millennials, the so-called millennials, that nobody has any money to go out and start on their own. The cost of living is so insane these days that most people can't, they have huge debts and they just can't sustain themselves. So yeah, they do end up living with their parents for a long, long time. So anyway, so Marion, she decides she's gonna go north, and she's gonna maybe take the money to her fiance and pay his debts, and they can finally get married and have the life that they wanted, which can't do. I mean, if you suddenly come into 40 grand and you were entrusted with it and your boss is missing it, yeah, they're going to be asking some questions. But for a while, it's a nice pipe dream. So she ends up at the Bates Motel. And she gets a room. Oh, and she swaps out her car a couple times before she ends up at the hotel. And Norman has dinner with her. And they start talking about his, his mother and things, and he gets kind of weird. And she suggests that maybe his mother should go in an institution, and he gets really weird. So she's like, okay, I'm gonna go to bed now. So she starts taking a shower, and then of course the big scene happens. And that's another thing that I found interesting. It's twisty enough that even though you know what's going to happen, it's still pretty creepy and shocking. Ugh. I mean, it's pretty gruesome, and he beheads her, and you're just like, ugh, the whole time. So then we go to the next scene, which is Mary's fiance. His name's Sam Loomis. And that's another thing too, that name. That's the name of the that's also the name of the doctor in Halloween, which I assume was a shout out to Psycho. But I don't remember reading that anywhere, and I don't have confirmation that it was, but I'm going to assume it probably was. Because I don't think, because horror tends to sort of feed on itself and refer back to itself. So then he's at his hardware store, and Mary's sister goes to see him, and she's like, have you heard from Mary? He says, what do you mean? I haven't talked to her in weeks. And I guess he's some kind of a bondsman. He shows up. He's an investigator. And he shows up and he says, I was hired by the bank to find out what happened to this money. And he starts asking Sam, what do you know about it? And Sam's like, I don't know anything. I haven't talked to her. And so the bondsman, whose name I have completely forgotten now, and I can't look it up, begins with an A. I want to say Altamont or Altamane, but I don't think that's right. Anyway, so he goes to talk to Norman. They sort of come to the conclusion, hey, there's this, there's this motel nearby. Maybe she could have stopped there. They come to this conclusion, so he goes to talk to Norman. And they get this weird phone call that he's got a lead, and he'll call them back in a few minutes once he's talked to Norman. Well, he never calls back. So Mary's sister, name's Lois, is like, no man, I'm calling the cops. This is weird. There's something really strange going on here. So Loomis says, well, you go get the cops, and I'll go to the motel. What is it that happens then? Anyway, they split up, and same as it happens in the book. Instead of going to the cops, Lois goes and she starts snooping around the fruit cellar where Norm has locked his mother, and we find her gross and rotting corpse. And and of course, Norman had this thing about taxidermy, which it's been a very long time since I saw the movie, and I remember all the stuffed birds in the movie, but I don't remember putting two and two together that Norman had dug up and stuffed his mother. What the hell? So anyway, it turns out, and he brains her, and he's about to kill her when everybody else comes swooping in, and then they drag the ditch to the swamp where he sank the car, and they find the bodies, and everybody's calling for, they're thinking, oh, he's been doing this for years and years, and so on, and that's kind of where it ends. And then we get a conversation between Lois and Loomis, and he fills in all the expository part. Now here's where, oh boy, here's where it becomes a little bit problematic, because they say, oh well, Norman was a transvestite. Do you know what that is? Lois nods. And we have come such a long way in understanding what goes into, the difference between cross-dressing as something of sort of a sexual fetish versus gender identity versus dissociative identity disorder, which is a completely different thing. And generally, I'm glad that we understand now that people who are mentally ill are much more likely to be the victims of violent crimes than the perpetrators of violent crimes. And compounding that is the case of Ed Gein, which we can't talk about Psycho without talking about Ed Gein. Now, one thing I was really surprised to find out was that Robert Bloch, even though he was writing Psycho around the time of Ed Gein's trial. Now, Ed Gein was arrested in 1957, and I believe early 1959, he was sentenced. Like, his trial went through fairly quickly. I mean, relatively quickly in terms of the way the justice system works now, where it can take years and years and years. So Ed Gein, as most people know, he was that guy, that weird guy who had this controlling, manipulative, fundamentalist, abusive mother. And when his brother, I think his brother died, if I'm not mistaken, it was just him and his mom kind of rattling around. And when she passed away, he had a break of some kind, and he started robbing graves and making really grotesque trophies out of the skins and the body parts. And he murdered a townswoman, and I think it did come out later that he murdered another woman as well. And he stretched their skins, the way that you would tan leather. And apparently he wanted to make a suit so that he could dress up like his mother. Which, that is accepted as some of the facts of the case, and that he wanted to crawl inside of his mother. But it wasn't a sexual thing for him. He didn't have sex with the bodies. He didn't like the smell, and so on. But Ed Gein was not a transvestite per se. He certainly was not transgender per se. I think that he was somebody with I don't think there is a word in the world for what Ed Gein was and what he did. Excuse me. Even the term serial killer doesn't apply the same way it does to other serial killers. Partly because he only barely qualifies. It used to be they had to kill 3 people to qualify as a serial killer, but then they changed it to 2 because it had to be done in like a ritualistic way, right? So, anyway, excuse me. I was surprised to read that Robert Bloch, even though he was writing around the time of Ed Gein's crimes, was not inspired by Ed Gein. He actually didn't know about the case until after the book was finished, and he added a little bit, a sentence in there to sort of give a nod to Gein. And that he was writing about the quiet guy in the neighborhood that you realize is capable of anything, and that is capable of monstrous things. So I thought that was kind of interesting. It does, and the psychology in the book, I think at the time, it's very, very textbook. This is a fractured psyche, and this you have a man, a woman, and a child in the same mind frame. Now, I'm not sure if that's Jung or, because Jung had the idea of the anima and the animus, and each personality had both the masculine and the feminine, and you had to kind of bring them together if you wanted to be a whole person. But when you fractured the mind, then things weren't quite what they should be. And it's not quite Freud with the id, the ego, and the superego, although there's a little bit of that in there as well. So it's a pretty, the way that Norm is drawn at the very end, where they're trying to give the psychological explanation, is very, it's very, I wouldn't say it's debunked theories of psychology, but very, very old. And We know so much more about what causes dissociative identity disorder now. And it's unlikely that a man that is that grown who doesn't have a history is just suddenly going to have these other alternate personalities. You know, there's usually more to it than that. But anyway, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, you're talking to somebody who reads too many armchair psychology things and watches far too many movies about serial killers. So that's my review of Psycho. I'm going to give it 4.5 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed the audiobook, and I enjoyed getting it from Chirp because it was nice and cheap. It was on sale. And yeah, hope you're reading lots of horror. Have a great day.